40 years of marriage. And yet the week I buried my husband, I came home to find the locks on my own house changed. And through the window, I saw my mother-in-law going through my closet, as if everything I owned had suddenly become hers. Thank you for watching and for staying with me through this story. I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It means more than you know to share that connection. My name is Mildred, and I live here in Iowa, where the cornfields stretch further than the eye can see, and the seasons paint the sky with colors that stay in your memory forever. I am a 72-year-old woman who spent her whole life being a wife, a mother, and a keeper of a home that was built out of both love and sacrifice. For more than 40 years, I stood beside my husband, not as a shadow, but as the person who helped him keep his footing when the world pressed too hard. I gave up my own career so he could rise in his. I raised our children, tended to every corner of the house, and kept it not just as walls and windows, but as a place where love had roots and where family found strength. When my husband passed, the silence in that house was heavy, heavier than I had ever known, and grief sat with me like an uninvited guest who would not leave. I thought I would at least have the comfort of that home. The photographs on the wall, the quilt folded at the end of my bed, and the garden we planted together that still bloomed faithfully each spring. But grief has a way of opening your eyes to betrayals you never thought would reach your doorstep. Instead of comfort, I found locks that would not turn, and the shadow of my mother-in-law rifling through my life, as though everything I had touched, everything I had tended, everything I had sacrificed for, was hers to claim. I stood there, stunned, the weight of both loss and disbelief pressing against me. And in that moment I realized that sometimes the hardest blows do not come from fate, but from the very people who should stand beside you when you are most fragile. My name is Mildred, and when I tell you that my life was not built overnight, I mean it in the deepest way, because every piece of my story has been stitched together with sacrifice, patience, and a love that I thought would carry me until my very last breath. I met my husband when I was still a young woman with dreams in my pocket, dreams of maybe having a career of my own, traveling, or even just building something that belonged only to me. But when I fell in love with him, I chose instead to build my life around his. I do not regret it, because love makes you willing, and in those days it felt like enough to stand by his side and watch him rise, knowing that my hands were the ones steadying him when the ground grew shaky. I became the heart of our home, the one who cooked and cleaned and stretched every dollar, the one who raised our children and stayed up through sickness, the one who never left his side when long hours at work took their toll. Everything I poured into that house was not just labor, it was devotion, and I thought the world could see that truth. But his mother never did. She never once looked at me with respect, never once said thank you for the years I spent shaping her son's world. From the very beginning, she treated me as if I was just passing through, as if the bond between me and her son was temporary, something she could one day erase. I learned to live with her cold remarks, her whispers at family gatherings, and her way of pretending that everything we built was owed to her instead of acknowledged as ours. For decades I carried that weight silently, thinking that one day time might soften her bitterness, but time only sharpened it. Even so, I held my head high, because my husband and I knew what we shared, and he often reminded me that without me, the life he built would never have stood as firmly as it did. When he died, I felt as though my own body had split in two. The grief was so raw that I could hardly eat, and nights became endless hours of staring at the ceiling, wondering how I would go on without him. Yet, even through that pain, I clung to our home, because it was more than bricks and mortar. It was a monument to our years together, filled with photographs, the smell of my cooking soaked into the kitchen walls, and the sound of laughter still echoing in the hallways. It was where I had carried babies in my arms, where I had stitched curtains with tired eyes, and where I had planted flowers in the soil until my hands were raw. That home was my life's work, and I believed that if nothing else, at least I would have that. But standing outside that door, watching my mother-in-law and her relatives treat my life's work as though it were a yard sale, I felt something inside me harden. My clothes were being shoved into trash bags as if my years meant nothing. My wedding album was tossed into a box marked for donation as though the vows I kept faithfully were scraps. And my jewelry, the few pieces I had treasured over a lifetime, was handled like loot to be divided among them. It was not just theft, it was erasure. An attempt to wipe away my presence from a home I had built with my own 2 hands. And though my heart ached, though grief sat in my chest like a stone, I did not scream or beg. I stood quietly and I smiled. Because while they saw me as powerless, I knew something they had overlooked. Something my husband and I had quietly secured years before. Something that would remind them that love and loyalty cannot be rewritten by greed. I stood there with my hands trembling. Not from fear, but from the shock of what I was seeing. Because it is one thing to lose a husband, and another thing entirely to lose the sanctuary you built with him. My key no longer fit the lock, and as I pressed it again and again, trying to make sense of why the door would not open, I heard the unmistakable sound of drawers opening and closing, the muffled laughter of voices that had no right to be inside my home. I moved closer to the window and saw my mother-in-law, her hands deep in my closet, pulling down dresses I had worn to anniversaries and church, piling them into bags as if they were nothing more than rags. Around her, distant relatives I barely recognized carried boxes, and I noticed the words scrawled in marker, words like donation and estate, as if I had already been written out of my own life. The sight struck me in a way that grief had not, because grief at least was honest. Grief was the natural cost of love. This was something colder, something calculated, and it cut deeper than death itself. I watched as my wedding album, the same one I had held so many times over the years, the same one with pages worn from being touched on rainy afternoons, was tossed aside into a box with no care, as if the promises made inside those pages belonged to no one now. I saw jewelry I had saved for decades, being pocketed like trinkets, heard them speak of my furniture as though it were spoils to be divided. And through it all my mother-in-law's voice rose above the others, sharp and commanding, declaring, "This is my son's house. This is my son's life, and everything here belongs to me." My heart ached with a pain I cannot put into simple words, because every item they touched carried my story, my effort, my love, and yet in their hands those pieces meant nothing. For a moment I thought of storming inside, of shouting until my throat was raw, of demanding they leave, but something in me knew that anger would only feed their satisfaction. Instead I stood silently, watching them undo the life I had so carefully built, and as I did, a strange calmness settled over me. It was as if the air itself whispered, "Wait, hold steady. Let them believe they have won, because the truth you carry is far stronger than their greed." So I did not fight. I did not cry out. I simply let the moment pass over me. And as I stepped back from that window, I felt a small, steady smile form on my lips. For they had missed the one detail that mattered most, the detail that would turn all of their arrogance into ash. I finally turned the handle of the back door, the one that opened onto the kitchen. And when it gave way, I stepped inside quietly, my feet pressing against the floorboards that had held my weight for more than 4 decades. Boards that seemed to know me better than the people standing in that room. The moment they saw me, the noise stilled. And for a second, you could hear nothing but the tick of the old clock on the wall. My mother-in-law's eyes met mine, sharp and unflinching, and without hesitation she said, "You should not be here. This house belongs to my son, which means it belongs to me now." Her voice did not tremble, her certainty was like steel. And she looked at me not as the woman who had shared her son's life for over 40 years, but as an intruder trespassing in her imagined kingdom. I glanced around and saw my clothes stuffed into plastic bags, my shoes lined against the wall as if ready for disposal, my jewelry boxes pried open with their contents scattered, and the album of my marriage resting half-closed at the bottom of a donation pile. I felt every part of me ache at the sight, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of tears or begging. Instead, I stood tall, letting the silence stretch between us until her confidence began to flicker in the weight of it. She went on, speaking loudly as though her words could drown out the truth, saying that I had no claim, that everything in these rooms was tied to her bloodline, that I was nothing more than a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Inside, my heart throbbed with grief, with anger, with the sting of being erased. But I knew that my power lay not in shouting, but in remembering the one truth she had overlooked. I thought of the nights I spent beside my husband in his final years, the way he reached for my hand, the way he whispered to me that he wanted me safe when he was gone, and the way he told me not to worry because he had taken care of everything. That memory wrapped around me like armor, and as my mother-in-law raged and her relatives shuffled awkwardly, I remained still, listening, absorbing every cruel word, every claim, every insult. I let them think they were winning, because silence has a way of unsettling those who expect you to break. And though my heart was heavy, I smiled quietly, for I knew that the papers tucked safely away in a lawyer's office carried more weight than any of their greedy hands could ever grasp. I stood there letting her words circle the room, sharp and heavy like stones being thrown. But instead of breaking me, they only reminded me of everything I had already endured. I thought back to the years when my husband and I built this home piece by piece, when we saved every extra dollar just to make a payment, when I worked nights and mornings so that we could keep the lights on and food on the table. I remembered sewing curtains by hand because we could not afford new ones, planting flowers in the yard to make it feel alive, and mending walls when the years wore them down. Every corner of that house carried my touch, my labor, and my love. Yet now it was being claimed as if I had been nothing more than a shadow standing beside him. Her voice kept pressing, calling me undeserving, calling me nothing, insisting that I had no right to keep what she decided was hers. And still I said nothing. I let her words hang because silence can sometimes feel louder than a scream. And deep inside I carried the memory of a night 2 years before, when my husband sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands folded over mine, his eyes soft but serious. He told me he had made arrangements, that he had placed the house, the accounts, and every possession we held into a living trust in my name alone, that he wanted to make sure I would never face the cruelty of being pushed aside once he was gone. I remembered how I cried then, not from sorrow, but from the relief of being seen and protected in a way only love can provide. That memory steadied me now as I stood in that same kitchen, though the table had been cleared of my things and my mother-in-law's hands clutched at objects that were never hers to hold. She thought she had stripped me bare, that grief had left me powerless, that silence meant defeat, but she had forgotten the most important detail of all, the promise my husband left behind in both paper and love. I did not need to shout or plead because my strength was already written into law, carried in documents they had never seen, documents that would turn their arrogance into nothing more than empty noise. And so I breathed deeply, let my eyes rest on the faces around me, and allowed myself to feel not despair but a quiet certainty, because the truth was mine, and soon it would stand tall against all of their greed. I stepped back from the room and felt my breath steady, because while their hands reached for what was not theirs, my mind reached for the strength I had kept tucked away for this very moment. I walked out quietly, not because I was defeated, but because I knew that fighting with words in that moment would only leave me drained, and they would not listen to anything but their own greed. The air outside was cool against my face, and as I stood there, I thought of all the years I had given, all the pieces of myself that were stitched into that home, and I refused to let it all be erased by voices that had never lifted a finger to build it. My heart was heavy, but beneath the weight of grief there was a pulse of determination, the kind that comes when you realize you are not helpless, not voiceless, but armed with the truth that will not bend. I walked down the street, my steps slow but steady, until I found the old payphone near the corner store, the one I had passed countless times before without ever thinking I would need it. My fingers shook as I picked up the receiver, not from fear, but from the enormity of what I was about to do. When my lawyer answered, I spoke softly yet firmly, telling him that the time had come, that what my husband and I had prepared for was now unfolding. He listened, his voice calm, reassuring me that I was safe, that every document had been carefully drawn, signed, and sealed long before this day, and that all I needed to do now was stand steady while he set the rest in motion. When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange calm wash over me, as if the weight that had pressed so hard against my chest was finally lifting. I turned back toward my home, the same home they thought they had taken from me. And as I walked each step closer, I no longer felt like a grieving widow standing alone, but like a woman holding the hand of her husband's promise. The memory of his words returned to me, the sound of his voice when he said he wanted me protected, that he could not bear the thought of me being cast aside when he was gone. That memory became a shield, and as I reached the edge of the yard, I lifted my chin, knowing that soon they would come to understand that their arrogance had blinded them, and that their victory was nothing but an illusion. When I returned, the house looked the same from the outside, quiet and still. But inside, I knew they were still picking apart my life, as if it were a pile of scraps waiting to be claimed. I opened the door with steady hands, though my heart beat hard against my chest. And when I stepped into the kitchen, every eye turned to me, as if I had interrupted something they thought was already theirs. My mother-in-law straightened her back, clutching one of my jewelry boxes, as if holding proof of her imagined victory, and she said coldly that I had no right to be there, that everything I saw was hers to decide and hers to keep. I did not answer right away. I let the silence breathe through the room, because silence unsettles those who live on arrogance, and I wanted her to hear the weight of it pressing against her words. Then I looked at her, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who already knows how the story ends, and I told her that she was mistaken. She tried to laugh, tried to gather her relatives around her like a wall, insisting again that this was her son's home and that my place here had ended with his last breath. I let her finish every word. I let her dig deeper into her own conviction, and then I laid the papers on the table between us. My lawyer stood at my side, his voice steady as he explained that every part of this house, every account, and every belonging had been placed into a living trust under my name, not hers, not theirs, and that the law was not on their side, but on mine. The room fell into silence then, the kind of silence that does not comfort but stings, and I watched their faces shift from boldness to disbelief. My mother-in-law's eyes widened, her voice catching in her throat as she tried to protest, tried to call it unfair, tried to claim that I had tricked her son, but the truth stood taller than her denial. I did not need to shout or argue. The papers spoke louder than either of us, and I knew in that moment that my husband's love had reached beyond his death to shield me once more. I stood quietly, my hands folded before me, and I smiled, not with triumph but with the deep, steady knowledge that dignity will always outlast greed. Her face twisted with rage as she slammed her hand against the table, shouting that I had stolen her son's legacy, that I was nothing but a guest who had overstayed, and that the house, the furniture, even the photographs on the walls were hers by blood and by right. Her words cut through the air like knives, but instead of wounding me, they fell dull against the armor I carried, the armor of my husband's foresight and the law that bore his signature. The relatives who had once stood so proudly beside her began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes falling to the floor, their hands loosening on the boxes they had packed, as if shame itself was pulling them back. I could feel the storm inside her rising, but I remained still, letting her fury echo into silence, because I knew that the louder she shouted, the smaller her claims became. I glanced at the album still resting in that box marked for donation, and for a moment my heart ached with the weight of it, because inside those pages was the story of a life built through love, through hardship, through nights of worry and mornings of relief, and it was not hers to discard. I reached down, lifted it carefully, and brushed the dust from its cover while she glared at me, daring me to defy her. I looked at her with calm eyes and whispered that these memories belonged to me, not because of paper or signatures, but because I had lived every one of them. My voice did not rise, yet the quiet steadiness of it filled the room more powerfully than her shouts ever could. And for the first time she faltered, her anger meeting a wall it could not break. In that moment I realized that this battle was no longer about possessions or even the house itself. It was about dignity, about whether the years I had given would be recognized or erased. And as I stood there, holding the album close to my chest, I felt the presence of my husband beside me, as though his hand was still guiding mine, reminding me that he had chosen me, not just in life, but in death as well. That knowledge was my strength, and as her rage burned brighter, and her allies stepped away, I understood that she had already lost, not because of the papers on the table, but because love and truth had already decided the ending. She tried to steady herself, her voice dropping from rage to something colder, something meant to wound in a different way, and she told me that I had turned her son against his own mother, that I had poisoned him with my influence, that all of this was the result of my manipulation. Her words dripped with bitterness, and for a brief second I could see the years of resentment she had carried. Years of convincing herself that I was the obstacle between her and the life she thought she deserved. But instead of breaking me, those accusations only reminded me of the countless nights I had sat by my husband's bedside, holding his hand as he whispered his fears, his hopes, and his determination to leave me protected. She had not been there in those moments. She had not heard him when he said with trembling breath that his greatest peace would come from knowing I would never be left at the mercy of her cruelty. I stood straighter then, holding my album in one hand and resting the other gently against the table where the papers lay. And I told her softly that nothing here was stolen, nothing here was taken by force. It had all been chosen and written by the very man we both mourned. I reminded her that love cannot be erased by bitterness, and that the truth she had tried so hard to bury was already alive in every corner of this home. My voice was calm, but the strength in it carried through the room, making even the relatives behind her draw back, as if they too could feel the weight of what I was saying. She shouted again, calling it unfair, calling me heartless, and yet each word seemed to lose its strength, because deep down she knew the truth she could not escape. Her eyes darted to the lawyer, to the officers who stood waiting, and finally back to me, and for the first time, her certainty cracked. I did not gloat, I did not raise my voice, I only looked at her with the steady calm of someone who had nothing left to prove, and I smiled quietly, for I knew that in this battle between greed and dignity, dignity had already won. The room grew heavy with silence after my words, and for a long moment no one moved, as if even the walls were listening. My mother-in-law's face twisted between fury and disbelief, her hands shaking as she clutched at the jewelry box she had taken, and then with a sharp cry she threw it back onto the table, the sound echoing through the house like a final admission that she had no ground left to stand on. She tried to rally herself once more, muttering that it was unfair, that she was his mother, that nothing could change that. But even as she spoke, her voice had lost the sharp edge it once carried, and the relatives around her began to slip quietly toward the door, no longer willing to stand on sinking ground. I gathered the album to my chest and walked slowly into the bedroom, the same room she had tried to shut me out of, and I looked at the bags stuffed with my clothes, the drawers left half open, the blankets thrown carelessly onto the floor. It felt as if they had tried to strip me of not only possessions but of memory itself. And yet, as I bent to pick up the quilt I had stitched with my own hands years ago, I knew that what they had taken apart could be rebuilt, because the love behind it was still mine. I smoothed the fabric with trembling fingers, remembering the nights I had sewn it by lamplight while my husband read beside me. And in that simple act I felt his presence wrap around me again. Steady and unshakable. When I returned to the kitchen, the lawyer nodded to me, his voice calm but firm as he explained once more that the trust left no room for argument, that the house, the accounts, and every belonging within these walls were under my name alone, and that any attempt to claim otherwise would be met with the full weight of the law. My mother-in-law's eyes flickered with desperation, but she could no longer form a protest, and in the silence that followed, I realized that the battle was over. I did not shout, I did not gloat, I only stood with my back straight and my chin lifted, because I understood that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from words of triumph, but from the quiet assurance that truth has already spoken louder than any voice raised against you. When the officers finally stepped forward and asked her to leave, The sound of her protest filled the house, sharp and bitter, yet it no longer had the power to pierce me the way it once might have. She clung to the doorway, shouting that she had been wronged, that everything around her was hers by blood, that no piece of paper could change what she believed to be true. But the truth had already settled over the room like a weight too heavy to deny. And slowly, with every step she was guided out, the noise of her anger faded until only the stillness of the house remained. I stood there, my hands resting on the table where the documents lay, and I breathed in that quiet, a quiet that felt both heavy with loss and light with relief. I walked slowly through each room, picking up what they had scattered, folding clothes back into drawers, smoothing blankets across the bed, and returning photographs to their shelves. Each act was small, yet each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they had tried to take away. I paused at the window where I had first stood watching them through the glass, and I thought about how close I had come to losing everything, not because of death, but because of greed disguised as family. I realized then that grief had not made me weaker. It had made me see more clearly. It had taught me that silence can be a shield, and that sometimes the strength of a woman is not measured in how loud she shouts, but in how firmly she stands. As I moved through the house, I felt my husband with me, in the walls we had painted together, in the floorboards we had walked across so many times, in the garden outside that still held the imprint of our hands. His promise had held true. His love had stretched beyond his last breath to protect me, and I whispered softly into the quiet that he had chosen me not once, but twice. In life and in death. That truth filled me with a peace I had not felt since the day he was taken from me. And as I placed the wedding album gently back on the shelf where it belonged, I understood that no matter how much they had tried to erase me, they could not undo the life we had built, nor the dignity that would carry me forward from this day on. That night, as I sat at the edge of the bed with the quilt pulled softly into my lap, I let the silence wrap around me, not as an emptiness, but as a kind of gentle reminder that peace can return even after the hardest storm. I thought of everything that had happened, of the locks changed, the bags filled with my clothes, the cruel words meant to push me out, and I realized that what they had tried to take was never really theirs to begin with. What belongs to you, what is written in love and protected in truth, cannot be stolen by hands of greed. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to my husband, knowing that his care for me had outlived him, and I promised myself that I would never again let anyone make me feel small in the very place I had helped to build. And now, to you who have walked with me through this story until the very end, I want to thank you from my heart for listening, for staying with me through every turn, every moment of pain and quiet strength. It means more than you know to share this time together. And if my story touched something in you, I hope you will subscribe so that we can continue to share these truths. Because sometimes the stories we carry remind us that we are not alone.